Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Joining me today is Dr. Mark Springer from the University of Mary Political Science, actually professor at the University of Mary. Dr. Springer, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
As we get started, first off, tell the folks a little bit about yourself, your background, where you're originally from.
Sure. I grew up in Bismarck, North Dakota. Ended up attending University of North Dakota and getting my bachelor's degree in political science and my master's degree in political science there as well. And then ended up going to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln for my PhD. Ended up back in North Dakota, taught for Minot State for 4 years, and then this is my 6th year at the University of Mary.
Okay. Well, what got you interested in politics?
Well, that's a good question. Originally, when I started college, I thought that I was on track for the law profession, and somewhere along the way, I just really gravitated towards political science, really interested in the teaching aspect and understanding how civics works, because it just baffles me how people aren't more involved in the system. I mean, we have this great, wonderful democracy that represents the people, and yet people don't, participate anymore. And that was just a question that really ate at me and drove my whole idea of what politics is really about.
Okay. Well, today we're going to talk a lot of politics. In fact, we've got races at the national level and at the local level that we want to talk about. So it's going to be an interesting year, I believe, as many people are saying, both nationally and in North Dakota. But I assume things have changed since 2010, when sort of the Tea Party came along and really had some impact in the election then. And so how do you think the country is right now?
Well, you're right. I mean, there have been a lot of different changes, and I think a lot of it is coming from the social media aspect. People can get so much more information in so many different places, and that's been true for the last decade. But I think more and more people are turning to the internet and different social media outlets like Facebook to exchange information, and so that message can either help or hurt, third parties like the Tea Party. And expand the message further and get more people involved in the process.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, 2010, not necessarily a presidential election year, but the country was in wanting change, and the voters did a significant amount of change at the national level. What's it like, the difference in an off-presidential year and a presidential election year?
Well, 2010 was more a referendum on the presidency, looking at where are we at as far as the state of the economy, trying to figure out what direction the country should take. And now with the presidential election year, I tell my students, it gets amped up. Mm-hmm. The whole process gets magnified, and everything becomes more important because of the fact that the coattail effect used to be the whole picture, where if the president can pull people into Congress. I'm not sure if that's the case anymore. A lot of journal studies have looked at that concept and said it's probably fading out because we've had such candidate-centered campaigns. And so I think that's going to be the key in 2012 is the face time that each candidate gets, how much information they can get out, and how they can get their message across throughout, like I said before, the social media aspects. Are they getting, is their message getting talked about on blog sites?
Okay. Well, let's get back to national politics later. Let's and the presidential debate between President Obama and Mitt Romney. But right now, let's talk about North Dakota. One of the big things that's going to be on the primary June the 12th is the Measure 2. Mm-hmm. Got a couple of measures, but let's talk about Measure 2, which basically is eliminating the property taxes. Can you talk about what that really is and what you see in that coming up in June?
Well, I mean, a lot of the origins of that started with the last legislative session, and people wanted to push that through in the last legislative session. It didn't succeed. A lot of the focus from the proponents of Measure 2 is coming from the idea that North Dakota is ranked in the top 10 for at least the last 20 years in rates of property tax compared to other states. In fact, I think one of the latest data polls that I saw was that we're like number 7 or number 6 as far as property tax per capita. and that's unusually high for a state this small. And so I think there's ground level sentiment that we have to change something, and a lot of people want to just eliminate it completely, because then that would open up, as the proponents say, more opportunities for business, allow people then to move into the state, maybe attract more people to the state. Now the big question becomes then, what do we do after that if you eliminate the property tax?
Mm-hmm. Do you see any strong ways, one way or the other, in that as you talk out in the community, or do you have any opinion there?
I think it's going to be 60-40, but I think people will end up voting against. And a lot of people that I've talked to, they're in favor of the idea of doing something about property taxes. They just think this goes too far. I think either way, the state legislature is going to have something big on their hands to deal with. If it gets passed, the state legislators are going to have to step up and figure out, okay, what are we going to get our money? Where are we going to get our money from? Does the burden fall on local governments then? And then if it doesn't pass, I think it still, if it's a close vote, it still sends a strong message. And I think that message has gotten across to a lot of the folks that I've talked to running for office and currently in the state legislature, that they know that they have to do something about the property tax issue. It's just, what direction they should take to achieve those goals.
Okay. Moving on to another issue, Measure 4, I believe, concerning the UND nickname. It's been in the papers a lot. Been a lot of activity over the past couple of years on this. And it can be a little confusing, I think, on the yes or no aspect. So can you talk about this measure and what it ultimately means and what exactly they're voting on?
Well, yeah, it is somewhat confusing, because I think a lot of people that I've talked to in the general public think that it's a yes or no on do we keep the nickname or not. And it's really yes or no, do we accept the legislature's decision last November when they met with the NCAA, whether or not they dropped they voted on and accepted to drop the nickname. And it's kind of a rejection of that measure by the legislature. The proponents of Measure 4 are stating. Again, this is something that I think it's overwhelmingly going to be supported throughout the state. The bigger issue is whether or not a federal body like the NCAA will accept that fact, and what that means constitutionally then when we go forward as a state. The North Dakota State Supreme Court, I believe, did the right thing. They couldn't actually hear the case as such before them regarding this being on the ballot. And so I think moving forward, it might end up back in the state court's hands, how to deal with this issue. And is that where we want the issue being dealt with, is in the state court? And no offense to the North Dakota State Supreme Court. I know all of them, they're fine individuals. It's just that, now you're putting that decision in the hands of 5 people instead of the entire state. And also the fact that ultimately the state might not have any say. Again, like I said before, the NCAA has their governing rules, and what impact does that have on UND as they move forward?
Okay. Well, anyway, 2 interesting measures for people to consider for this year. Well, in the June primary also, we're going to have 2 contested races, both in the House and the Senate, on the U.S. side, U.S. House, U.S. Senate. Let's first talk about Rick Berg, Dwayne Sands for the Senate seat right now.
And that's really interesting. I mean, that was something that I didn't even expect to happen. Normally, the Republican Party in the state of North Dakota is very well organized. I don't like to call it a machine in that effect, not like machine politics, but it's well run. And for this to happen was kind of a shock, I think, even within the system. I think Berg will win, but Sands put together a good effort and gotten a lot of different messages across that I think Berg's going to have to address. There's been a little bit of a backlash against Berg, and I think that's something that he's going to have to reinvent his image.
Okay. Most or some feel the congressional race, I guess, now we'll go congressional, between Brian Koch and Kevin Cramer will be close. Do you think Cramer's decision, not to seek the convention endorsement will hurt, or will it matter?
I think that'll hurt with the diehard, base of Republicans. And again, it goes back to that concept that I talked about, that this has been a well-run machine, and what's going on with that process. But I think for Kramer, it's in what he stated was it's a presumption of the fact that it's already decided before the convention, in essence. And so I think this is a bold move by him. Will it hurt, though, Brian Kalk in the general election, then presuming that he wins the race, the primary race in June, either candidate's going to come out, I think, a little bruised from this process.
And I guess, at least, again, only anecdotally what I hear, a lot of people are saying this may be a very close race here.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it could be, yeah. Kevin Kramer, I mean, he's well respected throughout the state. He's put together a lot of different campaigns throughout the years, and I know him, and I think he's a good guy. He's just, I think that's going to be the primary balance in this election, is going to be whether or not people are willing to say, okay, the primary process for the Republican Party doesn't matter as much anymore, or if there's going to be people that will cross party lines, so to speak, and vote for someone like Brian Kalk or Kevin Kramer.
Okay. Kind of go back to the Senate. You mentioned, I guess, you thought Rick Berg would win, but so what are the dynamics of a potential Rick Berg or Dwayne Sand, but Heidi Heitkamp matchup in the fall look like? Because some people think that might be another close race. How do you see it?
Very close. In fact, I've been trying to do my own little polling and whatnot, and I just think it's too close to call right now. And the reason being, I mean, this is what I've personally looked forward to as a political scientist, is a close race, because it generates interest, and I think a lot of people are interested to see, what ideas get out there, what concepts each candidate has. I mean, Heidi's kind of the big heavy hitter for the Democrats, and for them to get her back into politics and directly involved in this election, I think is great. And then again, that primary, the June primary, what happens there might really determine whether Rick Berg or Dwayne Sand, just have that strength going into the fall election. But I think, as a whole, they'll gather, most Republicans will gather behind Berg or Sand and, support them. But then we get into that east-west split in the state, and how is that going to play out? And then also, one of the dynamics I was looking at the other day, we have a lot of influx of temporary workers within the state in the oil field. And, state law allows them then to vote, having been in the state, well, most of them have been here for months. Mm-hmm. So, what direction will they vote? And, what can the candidates do to appeal to that different demographic? Well,
I hadn't thought about, that part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting variable there, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
All right. What about the race between Kalk and Kramer versus Pam Gullison? Can you talk about sort of the pros and cons for each candidate, and how you see that matchup?
Well, Pam's done a lot in fundraising and getting her message across the state, and of course, I think that's where the Republicans are losing out in that process, is that they've been, having to debate each other, mm-hmm. in a sense. And so I think that she's gotten a good head start, whether or not she can carry that over into the general election. But I think right now she's the favorite in that election. I think it'll be a close election. But the fact that she has that opportunity then to just, stick to her issues and go out and fundraise just for herself, whereas these two have been fighting for the same money and essentially fighting with each other, I think that's going to be one of the keys for the Republicans, whether or not they're able to then to counter, this big lead, in essence, that Pam Gullison has had in the race.
Mark, how much more interest has it been, obviously, with, Dorgan retiring, Pomeroy losing, and now Conrad retiring, with sort of the churn, I guess, mm-hmm. That's going on at the U.S. Congressional level. What kind of interest has that created in the political science arena?
Well, I think this is great. I mean, personally, I think this is great. It's kind of like the change in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s in North Dakota, when there's just kind of a changing of the old guard, kind of new people getting involved in state and federal level politics. And so mm-hmm. I think this will generate some interest, or at least some excitement in the races, because, I mean, before it was, you knew who was going to win. hands down, it's going to be Conrad, it's going to be Dorgan. And that was my big hope, like I said back in 2010, was that, the Dorgan you have that potential race that was going to happen, I should say, between Dorgan and
Well, was it going to be Hoeven?
Hoeven, yeah. And so, and then of course Dorgan dropped out, and so you don't have that race going on at the time. And I think that's what's exciting about this election cycle. You have a lot of interest generated from the new people getting involved, and you don't have the same old faces. In essence, I mean, you have some, but for the most part, there's a different opportunity for them.
Okay. Now let's pull it back to the state and talk about the governor's race for a little while. And it seems Democrats are more excited maybe about having Ryan Taylor as a governor candidate than they've had since maybe Heidi Heitkamp in 2000. Why is that?
He is really direct, and I think that's something that benefits him. He's gained a lot of support throughout the state as the alternative candidate in a sense. He's got a lot of support in the western part of the state, which traditionally has been a Republican stronghold. And I think a lot of that just goes back to his background, his farming and ranching background, and so he's made a lot of connections there. And I think that's why they're excited. He has a lot of inroad success from both sides of the aisle, and that he's built up through his years in the legislature.
Okay. And what is Taylor going to have to do to have a chance to sort of unseat an incumbent, of course, Governor Dalrymple?
Right. That's going to be very difficult. Dalrymple really struck hard, I think, with his proposal in helping out the western part of the state. I think that took away a potential issue, that Taylor had. And then you also have Dalrymple's strong support from, the different flooding issues throughout the state that he stepped in and helped out with. So I'm not sure. I think there's got to be a different issue that Taylor's going to have to, latch on to, or come up with a different plan. Maybe it's going to be something related to, tax proposal, or, how to fix the property tax issue.
Okay. Can you give us sort of a comparison, compare and contrast the two states within a state in North Dakota, sort of that, from a political perspective, obviously, that west versus east, and how culturally, socially, politically different it sometimes is? Well,
yeah, and a lot of it comes down to the ranching versus the farming communities. I mean, the western part of the state with the ranching, and the eastern part of the state with the farming. But you also have then these demographics that come out of the I-29 split, and I think that really has generated a different demographic in the eastern side of the state. And so historically, that's been a big deal. I mean, that was part of the original fight over where to put the state capital. And some historians say there wasn't much of a fight, and some say there was. And I guess it depends on your perspective. But that east-west split, again, I'm not sure how the demographics are going to play out west when you factor in some of these oil workers. How has that changed the overall culture then in the western part of the state? And I think you might be seeing a shift in that regard, and also with the population boom in the western part of the state. How is that going to impact state politics? So those are the things that I'm interested in seeing going forward culturally with the state, because that's one of the areas that I really like to look at is political culture, state political culture.
Okay. Well, we got to move on, and let's go to the presidential race for a few minutes. Will the election be a referendum on President Obama, or can Obama's team sort of turn it into a referendum on Mitt Romney with things like the Etch-a-Sketch candidates? Can you talk us through how you see this race going?
Sure. I mean, traditionally, when you look at a president with a bad economy, it's an uphill battle, and whether or not, again, there's a large amount of time between the November election, whether or not he's able to turn it around or show some successful signs of improvement in the economy. I think that's going to be the key for Obama. Romney, on the other hand, I mean, he has a pretty easy road in that regard, but he's had a lot of infighting, like you said, the Etch-a-Sketch, and I think that's the big key for him now is is staying on target with a message, and then picking a strong vice presidential candidate that's going to carry him over into the general election.
Okay. Well, President Obama's approval numbers have been going up a little bit with unemployment dropping, and you said economy always has a factor, but that's fluid and unpredictable with change. Can you talk about how Obama's fortunes could succeed or fail in this economy, on the economy? Yeah.
Right. Well, and I think it just depends on where the growth is, and that's something that I'm sure Romney's campaign is already looking at. I mean, you can say unemployment is down, but where is that growth? What sector is that growth in? And that's something best left for an economist to talk about. But, I mean, that's something that his campaign can really focus on and say, what are you really creating as far as jobs? And then the other factor, whether or not they're, government jobs, which has been one of the claims, too, that's come out of the Republican camp, is that there's too many government jobs being created, an increase in big government. And so Obama's going to have to counter that and have kind of a balanced approach to where is the economy improving, where do we go from here, in the future, because I think that's going to be the key, not just what you've done, but what you've done lately in regards to the economy.
You mentioned vice presidential candidate. How important is that going to be for Romney?
I think that's going to be huge. And I mean, you notice the buzz that was surrounding, the 2008 election with Sarah Palin, and Romney has to be careful. You don't want that VP candidate to overshadow you. I mean, there's a lot of strong suggested candidates, Rubio and Christie, but they're big names. And does Romney really want to take that chance with someone that's really a big name in that regard? Does he want to find someone that's more of a middle ground candidate, or someone that can play to the the Republican fears that Romney's too middle ground? And so I think that's going to be a tough balancing act for him, which is why he'll probably wait until days before the convention to make a decision.
Okay. And how is President Obama a different candidate than he was 4 years ago? And of course, the Supreme Court's upcoming decision on the constitutionality of the health care law, will that have any impact?
Well, the Supreme Court case will have a huge impact. I think that's almost a referendum on the health care plan itself, and whether or not, because that's such a key part of Obama's legislation and his big push when he first started as president. That will have a huge impact on the election. But Obama has really changed his game style. I mean, he started off his first 2 years really pushing the agenda, and then he backed off. And now it'll be interesting to see, lately he's taken more of a conciliatory approach to some of the political issues and trying to reach across, okay, what can we do to change, like the Affordable Health Care Act, to accommodate more people. And so I think that's what he's going to have to do. He's going to have to pull a Bill Clinton in 96 and say, okay, I'll give you this in return for that, a compromise package in order to get reelected.
Okay. What are some of the key states that will determine the presidential election, you think?
Well, Florida's huge. I mean, it's always, for decades, it's been about Florida. And then, lately I've been reading a lot about Nevada playing into that as well. And so I think the key thing are going to be demographics. I mean, Romney's trailing with female voters and with the Latin American community. And so again, someone like Rubio is somewhat appealing to win over Florida. But, Obama has such a strong support. What can change that support and shift that demographic?
Do presidential races hinge on who can turn out their base, or is it more who can court sort of the middle of the road, or is it a combination of both?
It's usually a combination, because I mean, if you have a candidate, traditionally that people like Jimmy Carter, for instance, the Democrats by 1980 they were a little bit sour on, didn't want to turn out to vote. So I mean that was. And then the economy was bad, and different factors that play into that. But demographics end up being huge in key states like Florida, because that vote is so close that if you can get the right demographics, you're going to help out your election chances.
Okay. And what impact do you think the media has played on voters and elections in the last 10 or 15 years?
huge impact. And because we have such diverse media, and so people can pick and choose which kind of media they want to select from. I mean, whether they tune into a show like this, where they get a broad spectrum, or do they tune into something that is very narrow focused, like I said, the social media aspect. I'm finding that more and more young adults are taking on that role of going to blog sites or going online and picking their media. So.
Okay. And Mark, I guess I wish we had more time because there's a lot more I'd like to talk about, but if people would like more information or find out more about politics, the upcoming races, where can they go?
Sure. The Secretary of State's office is great. I mean, they have plenty of, helpful links to help out voters. League of Women Voters throughout the states, great resource. And then, any local person that they want to discuss it with.
Mark, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Pulse for this week, and as always, thanks for watching.